Joanne's knees hit the gravel hard. The wheels of her expensive leather suitcase shattered on a sharp rock. She fell forward, tearing the sleeve of her silk blouse and scraping her palms raw against the dirt. She stayed down for a moment, listening to the hum of the distant highway fade into the dark forest. Then she pushed herself up, ignoring the blood on her hands. She was standing in front of a rotting, abandoned cabin deep in the woods. The roof sagged. The door hung off its hinges. Her name was Joanne. She was 61 years old, a former multi-million-dollar executive, and she had exactly $42 left in her pocket. What she found hidden beneath the floorboards of this decaying house wouldn't just save her life. It would rewrite the history of an entire city and completely destroy the family who tried to erase her. Stay with me on this one. Just 48 hours ago, her reality was entirely different. She held a senior management position. She lived in a company-leased penthouse. Her life ran on predictable, secure schedules. Then came the hostile takeover. The new board of directors liquidated her division overnight. Security guards escorted her from the building. They froze her executive accounts, pending a lengthy corporate audit. Her company housing was revoked immediately under an obscure contract clause. Decades of flawless service vanished into a legal void. Society removes its safety nets with terrifying efficiency. One moment you are a respected professional. The next, you are a trespasser in your own life. Joanne paused to massage her aching shoulder. The crisp autumn wind cut through her silk blouse. She was 61 years old. Her body was accustomed to climate-controlled boardrooms, not rugged terrain. Mud ruined her tailored trousers. Sharp stones bruised her heels through the thin soles of her office shoes. Yet, she refused to stop. The physical agony provided a sharp focus. It kept the overwhelming despair at bay. She could have reached for her phone. Her daughter owned a spacious house in Boston. Her son managed a successful firm in Austin. A single call would guarantee a warm bed and a hot meal. Joanne rejected the thought instantly. She had spent her entire adulthood providing for them. She was the anchor. She was the architect of their stability. Arriving on their doorsteps destitute meant shattering that foundation. It meant becoming a cautionary tale of aging and failure. Pride was the only asset she had left. She guarded it fiercely. The paved county road was a distant memory. She navigated a forgotten logging trail. The canopy of ancient oaks blocked out the afternoon sun. Shadows stretched long and distorted across the damp earth. Joanne relied on a memory from a decade ago. She had once audited a portfolio of abandoned rural properties. One specific plot had been deemed entirely worthless. It was a tax liability hidden deep in the state forest. She had memorized the coordinates out of sheer professional curiosity. Now, those numbers were her only destination. Her breathing grew ragged. The suitcase felt like a block of lead. Every muscle in her back screamed in protest. The temperature plummeted as evening approached. Survival instincts replaced her corporate acumen. She needed shelter before nightfall. The woods offered no sympathy to the unprepared. The wind picked up, rustling the dead leaves with a sound like whispering voices. Finally, the dense tree line broke. A small clearing opened up ahead. Joanne stopped. A wooden cabin stood in the center of the overgrown yard. It was a monument to neglect. The roof sagged heavily in the middle. Wild ivy choked the stone chimney. The porch boards were splintered and gray with age. This was the final refuge for a woman who had once commanded multi-million-dollar budgets. She approached the structure slowly. The silence was absolute. The front door hung precariously on a single rusted hinge. Deep scratch marks scarred the surrounding wood. The lock had been violently forced years ago. Joanne stood at the threshold. Behind her lay a world that had erased her existence. Ahead lay absolute darkness. She let go of the suitcase handle. The leather grip slipped from her blistered fingers. She placed her palm against the rough, damp wood of the door. With a firm push, she forced it open. The hinges shrieked into the quiet forest. The smell of dry rot and stagnant air drifted outward. Joanne stepped over the broken frame. She crossed the boundary into the shadows of the forgotten house, an unnaturally straight cut across a warped oak floorboard. That was the only anomaly in a house slowly surrendering to decay. Joanne tightened her frayed wool cardigan against the morning chill. The abandoned Victorian structure offered isolation, but it demanded absolute resilience. Drafts whistled through cracked window panes. Layers of hardened grime coated the remaining glass. She had spent her first 72 hours here, imposing strict order on the chaos. Survival required an unbreakable routine. She established a functional base camp in the dilapidated kitchen. A massive cast-iron wood stove became her primary source of heat and comfort. She scrubbed the soot-stained porcelain sink until the original white glaze finally showed through. Physical exhaustion was a constant, familiar companion. Her joints ached from sleeping on a makeshift pallet of old blankets. Yet, her mind remained incredibly sharp. Decades of managing complex corporate supply chains had trained her to notice minute discrepancies. This house was full of them. As she cleaned the rooms, she analyzed the interior architecture. The layout was highly eccentric. A secondary servants' staircase led directly to a solid brick wall. Built-in mahogany cabinets in the ground floor study featured unusually shallow shelving. Joanne began mapping the ground floor to pass the time. She used a piece of charred wood and the back of an old wallpaper scrap. The internal measurements simply did not match the exterior footprint. The parlor wall facing the main hallway was 3 feet thicker than structurally necessary. She traced the perimeter of the room, tapping the plaster with her knuckles. The sound remained a solid, dull thud until she reached the fireplace hearth. She knelt on the dusty floor. The original decorative rug was missing, leaving the bare oak planks exposed. Here, the natural grain of the wood was abruptly interrupted. A precise hairline fracture ran perpendicular to the main boards. It was not a natural crack caused by shifting foundations or moisture. Someone had used a fine-toothed jeweler's saw. Joanne found a rusted flathead screwdriver abandoned in the overgrown garden. She wedged the metal tip deep into the narrow seam. She applied slow, steady downward pressure. The old wood groaned loudly in protest. With a sharp snap, a rectangular section of the floorboard popped loose. A custom-built, zinc-lined cavity was hidden between the heavy floor joists. The metal casing had successfully repelled decades of rising dampness. Inside rested a thick leather satchel. The stagnant air filled with the distinct scent of dried machine oil and aged paper. Joanne lifted the bag out of the hole. It weighed at least 15 pounds. The dark brown leather was stiff, rigid from time, but completely intact. Heavy brass buckles secured the main flap. She worked the stiff straps free one by one. The first item she pulled out was a flat, velvet-covered presentation box. The brass hinges squeaked sharply as she opened it. 3 heavy silver medals lay on a bed of faded silk. The ribbons attached to them had lost their original vibrant color, turning a uniform, dusty gray. The deep engravings on the silver discs remained perfectly crisp. Excellence in Structural Engineering, 1924. The first name below the inscription was deeply scratched out. Someone had taken a sharp tool to the metal in a fit of rage. Only the surname survived the deliberate vandalism. Pendleton. Beneath the velvet box lay a massive, leather-bound ledger. The spine was heavily reinforced with thick canvas. Joanne opened the heavy cover. The pages were covered in dense, meticulous handwriting. The black ink had barely faded over the decades. There were no crossed-out words, no idle margin doodles. It was an obsessive, flawless record of construction. She turned the brittle pages with extreme care. Highly detailed architectural sketches filled the left-hand sides of the book. They were instantly recognizable city landmarks. The Central Municipal Courthouse with its domed roof, the downtown public library, the Grand Railway Terminal. These were iconic, historical structures. Official city records proudly credited them to the famous Pendleton Architectural Group. The firm was a celebrated cornerstone of local history. The inside cover of the ledger bore a clear, bold signature: Arthur Pendleton. Joanne knew the city's history intimately. The official narrative constantly praised Victor Pendleton, the charismatic founder and public face of the firm. Arthur was never mentioned in any civic brochure. He did not exist in the public archives or museum plaques. Yet, this hidden ledger held the original structural calculations for every single major building. It contained complex mathematical formulas for load-bearing arches. It detailed rigorous material stress tests conducted months before ground was ever broken. Arthur was the unseen, brilliant genius behind the entire city skyline. Victor was merely the salesman who took the credit. Joanne turned to the middle section of the book. Several pages from the harsh winter of 1932 were violently torn out. After that sudden gap, the tone of the entries shifted completely. The handwriting lost its perfect, measured symmetry. It became jagged and rushed. Arthur documented the systematic theft of his original blueprints. He recorded secret board meetings held without his knowledge. He detailed a ruthless campaign of professional erasure orchestrated entirely by his own brother. Arthur had been quietly and efficiently pushed out of his own legacy. He retreated to this isolated house. He built the hidden compartments with his own hands. He sealed his life's true work beneath the floorboards. He created a desperate time capsule, waiting patiently for a meticulous eye to finally find it. Joanne traced the deeply indented signature with her index finger. She understood the profound, crushing weight of being discarded by your own blood. She knew the sudden, disorienting loss of a lifelong identity. Arthur's forced silence resonated perfectly with her current forced exile. Arthur had left the unvarnished truth behind. He trusted the solid architecture to protect his secret. The freezing draft in the room suddenly felt completely irrelevant. Joanne pulled her heavy wooden chair closer to the radiating heat of the cast-iron stove. She fed another piece of dry scrap wood into the growing flames. She adjusted her reading glasses. She opened the heavy ledger back to the very first page. The house was no longer just a temporary shelter. It was a sacred archive. The meticulous resurrection of Arthur Pendleton's stolen legacy had just begun. A heavy fist pounding against aged wood shatters the morning silence. Dust drifts down from the cracked doorframe. The fragile sanctuary is breached. An elderly woman with no legal claim to this shelter faces a sudden, aggressive threat. Outside stands a man demanding his inheritance. He wants the lucrative secrets hidden within these walls. He expects to find an easy, terrified victim. He is severely mistaken. The door swings open with a violent crack. Marcus Pendleton steps over the threshold. He is the estranged grandson of the late Victor Pendleton. Marcus wears an expensive, sharply tailored suit. The pristine fabric clashes violently with the ruined, dusty interior of the parlor. His eyes scan the room with cold, impatient calculation. He spots Joanne standing quietly by the cold fireplace. A dismissive smirk crosses his face. He sees only a frail, destitute trespasser. He pulls a folded document from his inner pocket. He tosses it onto the scarred coffee table. Marcus gives her exactly 24 hours to vacate the premises. He claims absolute ownership of the estate. He casually mentions a private demolition crew scheduled to arrive by the end of the week. His voice is intentionally loud. He uses broad, aggressive gestures to dominate the small, confined space. He demands she hand over any valuables she might have scavenged. He specifically asks about his family's missing workshop inventory. He takes 2 steps forward, deliberately invading her personal space. The air grows thick with unspoken violence. Joanne does not step back. Her pulse quickens, her mouth goes dry. Yet, her mind instantly turns to ice. Fear is a deeply familiar opponent. She spent 40 years navigating hostile corporate takeovers. She managed crisis communications for failing conglomerates. She recognizes these crude tactics immediately. Marcus is relying on classic, brute force intimidation. Bluster almost always hides a fundamentally weak position. She glances down at the paper on the table. It lacks a formal court seal. It is a cheap bluff. She adjusts her glasses. She looks Marcus directly in the eye. She refuses to break contact. She does not raise her voice. A quiet, steady tone forces an aggressive opponent to stop and listen. She calmly points out the missing legal stamps on his supposed eviction notice. She informs him about the complex realities of adverse possession laws. She knows perfectly well she does not have full legal rights yet. But she also knows the actual eviction process takes many months, not mere hours. Marcus hesitates. His posture stiffens. The arrogant smirk fades entirely from his face. Joanne shifts the focus of the conversation. She brings up the hidden archive. She mentions the heavy, leather-bound ledgers. She casually drops the names of 3 prominent historical landmarks found in Arthur's private blueprints. Marcus freezes in his tracks. He believed the old workshop was completely empty. Joanne explains the true financial value of the documents. They are not simply dusty, forgotten papers. They represent the only existing proof of provenance for millions of dollars in undocumented, scattered historical assets. Marcus lunges toward the wooden box resting near the hearth. Joanne steps smoothly into his path. She informs him that the complete archive is no longer on the property. She moved the most crucial, incriminating ledgers to a secure, off-site location. She lies with absolute conviction. It is a survival skill, honed in countless high-stakes boardrooms. She tells him that any aggressive action, legal or physical, will result in the immediate destruction of those specific records. She explains the harsh reality of the architectural market to him. Without those ledgers, the physical assets he hopes to track down and sell are essentially worthless. They become mere old buildings lacking historical authentication. The documents are the key to the fortune. She holds the key. She watches his mind process the trap. He cannot risk losing the documentation. He cannot force her out without risking the archive. Marcus clenches his fists. His expensive suit suddenly looks restrictive and uncomfortable. He realizes brute force will cost him his entire inheritance. He desperately needs her cooperation. Joanne dictates the new terms of their engagement. She will remain in the house undisturbed. She will professionally catalog the entire archive. He will provide a legally binding agreement securing her temporary residence during this process. Marcus turns sharply toward the door. He promises to return soon, with his legal team. He slams the heavy door behind him. The house falls silent once again. Joanne exhales a long, shaky breath. Her hands tremble slightly, finally betraying the massive spike of adrenaline. The first critical battle is won. But the larger war has only just begun. She needs permanent armor. She needs powerful allies. The historical truth, hidden deep within Arthur's notes, must now become her ultimate, impenetrable shield. The heavy leather ledger sat on the dusty kitchen table. Its yellowed pages held the power to rewrite the biography of the 20th century's most celebrated architect. The rules of the game were about to change for everyone involved. Joanne stared intently at Arthur Pendleton's handwritten notes. These were not just basic structural calculations or supply records. They contained highly detailed accounts of unrecorded, brilliant engineering feats from the 1920s. The faded ink revealed the hidden, agonizing corporate battles that had ended his public career prematurely. More importantly, the text exposed a massive extortion ring run by the construction syndicates of that era. Arthur had refused to compromise a pivotal structural integrity test. He had been blacklisted. The heavy silver medals hidden beside the book corroborated every single word of his secret defiance. Victor Pendleton's heirs wanted this property desperately. Marcus planned to bulldoze the aging structure and sell the raw land to commercial developers. He had absolutely no idea what the rotting floorboards actually concealed. Joanne knew her former corporate background was her absolute best weapon. She needed an impenetrable legal shield immediately. A lone squatter in an abandoned house is an incredibly easy target. The designated custodian of a priceless historical archive is a formidable opponent. She walked 2 miles to the nearest public telephone outside a closed gas station. She dialed the private number of Harrison Vance. Harrison was a retired, highly ruthless corporate attorney. He owed her a massive favor from a vicious boardroom battle over a decade ago. He arrived the very next morning in a sleek town car. He brought thick legal pads and a deeply skeptical expression. His professional skepticism vanished the exact moment he examined the tarnished metals. He put on his heavy reading glasses to study the fragile ledger. The legal strategy formed instantly in his sharp mind. They would not fight Marcus over standard property rights or adverse possession. That was a slow, losing battle in local courts. Instead, they would file for an emergency cultural heritage injunction at the federal level. The house was no longer just neglected real estate. It was the pristine site of a highly significant historical discovery. The structure itself became part of the artifact's provenance. A lawyer provides a defensive shield. An academic provides an offensive sword. Harrison made a swift, demanding call to the state university. Dr. Eris Thorne was the leading international historian of early modern architecture. He drove down out of pure professional curiosity. He stayed out of sheer academic astonishment. Thorne worked meticulously through the entire night. He wore white cotton gloves to handle the deteriorating binding. He cross-referenced the specific dates in the ledger with digitized city planning archives on his portable computer. Everything matched perfectly. Arthur Pendleton had designed under a clever pseudonym during the missing 3 years of his career. He had battled against the corrupt syndicates in corporate boardrooms. The ledger proved his immense courage. The hidden metals validated his unrecognized architectural victories. Thorne drafted a comprehensive, legally binding sworn affidavit. He declared the collection a crucial discovery of profound national importance. He noted the specific chemical composition of the iron gall ink. He verified the distinct aging pattern of the cotton rag paper. There was zero doubt about the historical authenticity. Joanne's position transformed overnight. She was no longer a destitute woman hiding in the dark shadows of society. She became the legally recognized, exclusive trustee of the Pendleton Archive. Harrison filed the extensive paperwork at the county courthouse exactly at dawn. He secured a temporary restraining order against Marcus and his development company. The aggressive heir could no longer step within 500 feet of the property boundary. Any attempt to evict Joanne or alter the structure would now trigger a severe federal investigation. It would be classified as the deliberate destruction of irreplaceable heritage artifacts. The legal trap was set perfectly and snapped shut. Marcus arrived 3 days later. He brought a local sheriff, a demolition crew, and an arrogant smirk. He expected a rapid, tearful eviction process. Instead, Harrison met him firmly on the rotting front porch. The lawyer handed over a thick, intimidating stack of court orders. The sheriff read the official federal injunction carefully. He tipped his hat respectfully to Joanne, standing in the doorway. He immediately ordered Marcus and his crew off the premises. The look of utter defeat on the younger man's face was absolute. Brute force and intimidation had met intellectual strategy. Strategy won decisively. Marcus's loud threats evaporated into the crisp morning air. He was completely outmaneuvered by a woman he had severely underestimated. The news could not be contained locally for long. Thorne contacted his senior peers at the National Museum in the capital. Whispers of the newly discovered Pendleton archive began to circulate rapidly in elite academic circles. Journalists from major publications started calling Harrison's office incessantly. The narrative shifted dramatically overnight. It moved from a petty local property dispute to a major global historical event. Architectural historians demanded immediate access. Wealthy museum curators offered massive sums for the exclusive exhibition rights. Joanne controlled the entire narrative. She established a strict, uncompromising protocol for viewing the artifacts. She applied the exact same rigorous management skills she had once used to run massive corporate departments. She dictated the terms of every single interaction. She stood quietly by the window. She watched the dust settle on the long dirt driveway. She had successfully secured her sanctuary against all odds. She had done it without asking her successful children for a single dime of charity. The leather ledger rested securely in a newly purchased, heavy, fireproof safe. The legacy of a forgotten genius had provided her with an unassailable fortress. She had resurrected Arthur Pendleton's true, unvarnished history. In return, his history had given her a permanent, legally protected home. The world was about to learn the absolute truth about a legendary figure. Joanne would be the sole architect of that grand revelation. The immense weight of historical truth had completely crushed the petty greed of the present. The gavel of the auction house never fell. Joanne rejected the private collectors. She sat across from the museum directors inside a mahogany-paneled boardroom. The curators expected a fierce negotiation over the price of the artifacts. Joanne handed them a completely different contract. She held a collection worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. She refused every single cent. Her demand was singular and uncompromising. She wanted the legal deed to the abandoned property and the total restoration of Arthur Pendleton's name. The terms were absolute. The National Architecture Museum would receive the entire archive. They acquired every handwritten structural log. They took possession of the tarnished silver medals from the 1920s. In exchange, the Historical Society's legal team mobilized. They facilitated the immediate transfer of the property rights. Marcus Pendleton found himself trapped by his own greed. Facing a public scandal regarding his grandfather's hidden debts and his own attempted theft, Marcus surrendered. He signed away all claims to the estate. The decaying house officially belonged to Joanne. The academic world reacted with astonishment. Historians spent 3 months authenticating the blueprints. Arthur Pendleton had documented biomechanical analysis decades before the term existed. His notebooks detailed material stress tests used by modern engineers. The establishment had erased his contributions. Joanne forced them to rewrite the history books. She provided the undeniable proof. 6 months later, the Grand Gallery opened its doors. A heavy bronze plaque bore Arthur's name at the entrance. Glass display cases held his frayed leather drafting tools. Spotlights illuminated his silver medals. The exhibition detailed exactly how his stolen techniques shaped modern architecture. Justice materialized in the form of curated exhibits and published academic papers. Joanne attended the opening night. She stood near the back of the crowded hall. She wore a tailored navy suit. She watched journalists and engineers marvel at the man who had died in total obscurity. She did not seek the cameras. She did not give grand speeches. Her work was already finished. She had weaponized the truth. She transformed a forgotten ghost into a permanent pillar of architectural history. The morning papers carried the story across the country. Full-page photographs showed the exhibition and mentioned the woman who discovered the archive. These images reached her estranged children. The narrative of their mother had completely shifted. They believed she was a helpless burden wandering in exile. They suddenly saw a formidable strategist. Her eldest son drove 400 miles the very next day. Her daughter booked the first available flight from the coast. They arrived at the doorstep of the house they once considered a hazardous ruin. They expected to find a broken woman. They found a matriarch. Joanne opened the heavy oak door. The physical exhaustion that marked her early days of exile was completely gone. Her posture was straight. Her gaze was clear. She did not offer reproaches. She did not demand apologies for their past absence. The silence between them spoke volumes. Her children stepped over the threshold with newfound respect. The power dynamic had permanently shifted. She was no longer a dependent seeking shelter. She was the absolute master of her domain. The family reunion was quiet and practical. They sat around a newly purchased dining table. They drank coffee and discussed the future. Her children offered financial help. Joanne politely declined. The museum's endowment covered the property taxes for the next 20 years as part of the archive agreement. She had secured her own independence. Her children realized they could not manage her life anymore. They could only participate in it. The physical restoration of the house mirrored Joanne's internal revival. Contractors arrived the following week. They replaced the sagging roof beams. They installed modern plumbing and updated the electrical wiring. Fresh white paint covered the weathered exterior siding. The shattered windows were replaced with thick, clear glass. Joanne took charge of the grounds. The overgrown yard transformed under her disciplined hands. She cleared the dead brush. She planted hydrangeas and resilient perennial shrubs along the front walkway. The soil, once choked with weeds, now supported new life. The property shed its haunted reputation. It became a landmark of endurance. She kept one specific item from the archive. A single black-and-white photograph of Arthur Pendleton remained in her possession. She framed it in simple dark wood. She hung it in the main hallway. It served as a silent acknowledgement of their shared survival. Two discarded people had saved each other across the decades. Arthur provided the means for her salvation. Joanne provided the voice for his legacy. The winter approached, but the house was warm. Joanne sat on the restored front porch. She held a ceramic mug of hot tea. The neighborhood was quiet. She watched the evening light filter through the bare branches of the old oak tree. She had walked into the dust and shadows as a vulnerable outcast. She had faced intimidation, physical decay, and the crushing weight of isolation. She defeated them all. She did not just survive the collapse of her old world. She built a stronger one upon its ruins.